Welcome everybody to the November Science Seminar from the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. You're going to hear us say CASC, just FYI, as that's our abbreviation throughout the presentation. And I am Jess Delfiaco, the Communications Manager with the Midwest CASC. Thank you all for joining us. Very excited for our presentations today. Our main event will be our own Jessica Hellmann talking about some highlights and key takeaways from the UN climate meetings. But before we get there, I've got a few housekeeping things. You might have heard the ding that says we are recording this seminar. Just a heads up on that, and please select whether or not you want to be on video. And then please mute yourself as well until we get to the Q&A portion. The recording of this seminar will be shared with you via email. It'll also be up on the Midwest CASC YouTube page. And lastly, we will have a Q&A at the end of today's event. So feel free to pop questions in the chat box throughout, and we will get to them then. I think that's it for housekeeping. We'll do a quick overview of our agenda. I'm going to give you a little background of the Midwest CASC. We are going to hear from a new member of our team. And then several project PIs are going to share a little bit about their newly funded projects. And then we'll have Jessica talking about highlights from those meetings. Now, for anyone who has joined us before, you're going to have to bear with me for the next couple of minutes. But for anybody new to the Midwest CASC, this is a little background on who we are. Oh, and I've got a cat absolutely flying around in the background, so sorry if you can hear that. So the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, also known as the Midwest CASC, is a partnership between the USGS and a consortium of institutions throughout the Midwest. And it is hosted by the University of Minnesota. We are a part of a national network of these regional CASCs, all of which produce science that will inform resource management efforts and help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to a changing climate. So there's a map of all of our members throughout the region. And we accomplish this mission in several different ways. Here's just a few aspects of our work. We conduct synthesis research on topics relevant to regional science priorities. We support a network of graduate students and postdoc fellows. We partner with the College of Menominee Nation to run a tribal undergraduate research program. We host capacity building workshops, these science seminars, as well as an annual gathering. And we fund climate adaptation research through partnership with the USGS. With that, I think that is enough of an overview of us, and I'm going to invite Dee Lobo to talk for a couple minutes about herself. Go ahead, Dee.
Hello, you all. I'm Dee Lobo. I'm the new postdoc with the CASC. I'm a conservation scientist and with expertise in human dimensions of natural resource management and conservation. I have broad interest, and my research has used concepts and approach from socio-ecological systems and restoration ecology to entrepreneurship, workforce, and organizational development. So my work and my approach to science is very interdisciplinary and also very collaborative. So what motivates me in engaging with research and also with this project is the idea of bringing together the natural and social sciences and also bridging the gap between science, practice, and policy. My background, I earned a PhD in conservation science here at the University of Minnesota and a master's degree in forest ecology at the Federal University of Pernambuco in Brazil, where I'm originally from. In Brazil, I worked extensively with conservation planning, so from protected areas also to restoration ecology. My work with the CASC is in a project called the Synthesis Project of Adaptation Planning. So the idea is we are going to map and understand the state of the climate adaptation here in the Midwest region on the sectors related to natural resource management and conservation. So what we seek and our motivation is to understand current practices that for developing and planning climate adaptation in this region. And our main goal with this is to, based on this foundation, to identify and recommend best practices in climate adaptation, as well as from this foundation, support a evidence-based discussions on ecosystem-based strategy for adaptations with a community of practices. Would you like me to elaborate on anything else, Jess?
I think that was a great overview. If folks have questions for Dee, we can save them to the end. Feel free to pop them in the chat, and I bet she would respond to you there. But we can also talk later on, or I'm sure you could reach out directly to Dee, and she'd be happy to talk to you via email as well. Thanks and welcome again. We are very excited to have Dee on our team now. At this point, I think Sarah, you are up first to talk about your project. You can let me know if you are ready to go.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. Cool. Great to be here and see all of you. My name is Sarah Fitzpatrick at Michigan State University's Kellogg Biological Station in Southwest Michigan. And I first just want to say just that I'm really excited to be a part of the Midwest CASC and really looking forward to interacting with all of you over the next couple of years. The other co-PIs on this project are Cinnamon Matan, who's an NSF postdoc fellow in my lab, and Nick Haddad, who's also a professor at Kellogg Biological Station and an expert in the conservation of rare butterflies. So a major research focus in my lab is geared towards trying to improve the design, implementation, and monitoring of genetic rescue in species that are struggling with small population problems. So genetic rescue is this idea that we can infuse genetic variation into these small, potentially inbred populations, often doing so through human-assisted migration or augmentation from a larger, healthier population. And so our project, our CASC project, focuses on a federally endangered species of butterfly, the Mitchell-Sater butterfly. It's one of the rarest butterflies in North America. The species has this very interesting disjunct range with this handful of isolated and declining populations found in Michigan and larger, more connected, sort of, in theory, like healthier populations found in the Southeast, so in Alabama and Mississippi. And one concern for these really tiny, isolated populations that are sort of blinking out in Michigan is that a lack of genetic variation and other genetic problems associated with small population sizes is further accelerating these declines and limiting adaptive potential in the northern populations. And these are the exact populations that might need that variation more to be able to sort of keep projected changes in climate. And so given this, our project has two main goals. The first is to develop high quality genomic resources for the species for the first time, which includes developing a reference genome for the species and characterizing range-wide landscape genomic patterns to understand how populations are structured throughout their range, how much divergence and differentiation there actually is between the northern populations in Michigan and these southeastern populations, and to characterize geographic patterns of adaptive variation using sort of the most up-to-date cutting-edge genomic tools. And then our second major goal is to actually carry out a small number of controlled crosses between Michigan butterflies and one sampled from the Southeast to kind of help inform the managers of the feasibility of potentially infusing some of these struggling northern populations in Michigan with butterflies from healthier populations in the South. So this has been talked about in the past as a possible way to not only sort of infuse more genetic variation, but also potentially to like pre-adapt these northern populations as they cope and are faced with sort of increasing temperatures and climate change. And so these controlled crosses will allow us to like test the viability of hybrid offspring and test for differences in stress tolerance traits among different cross types. And I think really importantly, the goals of this project have stemmed directly from priorities identified by the Mitchell-Satyr Working Group and will directly inform, management actions taken for this species. And then the last thing I wanted to say is that although the focus of this study is on this one species of rare butterfly, I think this research approach and our results will help sort of broaden the application of genetic rescue in other species with small and declining populations, especially those with this like broad latitudinal range across a range of climates, and hopefully help broaden the use of this tool as a successful strategy for recovering small populations.
Thank you, Sarah. Again, if you have questions for her or for any of our PIs, feel free to pop them in the chat and we can talk about them at the end of the session today. Okay, Alexis?
Hello, my name is Alexis Grindy, and I'm a wildlife ecologist. I work at the Natural Resources Research Institute at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. So I'm based out of Duluth in northern Minnesota. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about the project. I'm excited about it. Myself, along with 3 other co-PIs, Robert Slezak, who's at the USDA Pacific Northwest Research Station, Brian Palick is also with the USDA, but in the Northern Research Station in Grand Rapids, and then Tony D'Amato, who's at the University of Vermont. We've been working on black ash systems for a while now, and this project really gives us the opportunity to look at both the adaptive and reactive strategies that are associated with managing black ash in the face of both climate change and emerald ash borer. Of course, they're very intertwined. So for those of you that don't know, there's over 1.2 million hectares of black ash across the Great Lakes region. And specifically in Minnesota, there's over 1 million acres. And it's really found in pocketed regions across the forested part of northern Minnesota, which is where our study has taken place. We're using a fully operational design where we have 8 study blocks, and in each block we have 4 different treatments. One is a control treatment of black ash. Another is an adaptive where we're using little gap cuts to try and regenerate some of the secondary species that are found in these systems. The third one is emulating the effects of emerald ash borer, which is not in our study area just yet, but I'm certain it's on its way. And then the fourth is a clear cut where we're basically taking out all the black ash and seeing what happens. So we're looking at that from a forestry perspective, but also a vegetation perspective, and specifically looking at what are the habitat characteristics that are changing between these different treatments, and then what is the response of different wildlife communities. And for this project, we're looking at breeding bird communities and then also small mammals. So how does it affect the ponding? How does the coarse woody debris affect the overall species? And trying to figure out what these treatments are doing to the small mammal and bird communities, but also like what's the best overall outcome for conserving biodiversity, because there is really unique communities in these black ash forested wetland systems. So we have a lot of different partners, including the USDA, the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, the 1854 Treaty, the Minnesota DNR, are all interested in what the results of this project are and how we can sort of mitigate the damage from emerald ash borer and these really widespread black ash forests that we have here in the Great Lakes region. So I'd love to take any questions if there are any in the chat. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. I can't remember who our next slide is. It's Darren.
Okay, great. So this project is funded by the USGS Future of Aquatic Flows, the CAP project, and this Midwest CASC is one of 9 postdocs that we're planning on hiring, and they're all going to get together at the end and have a synthesis project. So that's kind of the goal of this particular project. And the postdoc that's going to be working on this in conjunction with partners at St. Louis University, several members of the Little Traverse Bay bands of the Ottawa Indians, and as well as the Shedd Aquarium in Chicago. So we're going to be looking at how rain on snow events influence aquatic species throughout the Great Lakes Basin. And particularly what we're interested in is how do rain on snow events affect river temperatures. Particular species in the Great Lakes Basin, snow, trout, salmon, etc. They need a particular river temperature range to live in. And when it exceeds or goes below a particular range, they have to migrate, which is pretty hard to do, considering we built dams and reservoirs all over the place. So what this is going to do is simulate what these rain on snow events are going to do for river temperatures throughout the Great Lakes Basin. So the general hypothesis is that when you have rain on snow events, you have a large pulse of cold water entering the stream. And when you don't have that cold water later on in the season, it may influence how warm temperatures, these river temperatures are. So we're going to build a hydrologic model throughout the Great Lakes Basin. We are going to be working with the Shedd Aquarium and the Little Traverse Bay bands of the Ottawa Indians to develop a way to disseminate this information, whether that be through a website, presentations, Zoom webinars. Both of these groups are going to help disseminate this type of information and build up the results so that they're usable for these communities, especially the tribal communities in the Great Lakes Basin. So the goal would be to develop maps of where aquatic species may be able to live in the future and kind of compare where they are now, just solely based on this hydrologic model. So I would be happy to answer any questions in the chat if you have them.
All right, thanks so much, Darren. Dan, I think you are up next.
All right. I was just putting a question in the chat for Darren saying I'm looking forward to connecting with your project as well. So hi everyone. Sorry, I'm just sitting down here running from class. So our project looks at the kind of the interaction between seasonally varying climate change and changes in extreme precipitation, how the two interact in changes in flood hazard in the Midwest. And so the background there is that the projections show that the greatest amount of warming that we'll experience in the Midwest, or at least in the upper Midwest, is in wintertime, and that summer warms a little less than wintertime. They also show wetter spring and winter than summertime. And so if we look at the seasonal impacts of that, that may mean a earlier melt season and more rapid drying during the summertime of soil moisture and just the terrain. And so when you put extreme precipitation on top of that, and the projections show the likelihood of enhanced extreme precipitation, when you put that on top of this changing seasonal, the changing seasonality, the question then is, well, what does that mean for the characteristics of flood hazards in the future? And so our project has a couple of different objectives. The first is to look at just changing seasonality and changing conditions that would affect flooding in the Midwest, using a variety of model simulations and downscale projections. And then the second is to do some case studies on 3 different river basins across the Midwest. Whoops. Sorry, I just lost 3 different river basins across the Midwest. One of them that spans sort of a gradient of winter mean conditions. So one is the South Fabius River in Missouri. The other is the Kickapoo River and so the South Fabius would be a not snow dominated winter landscape. The Kickapoo River, where there's likely going to be a large change in the sort of snow conditions in the future. And then the Kettle River in Minnesota, which is more of a sort of a deeper winter situation. And then in addition to that, we are developing using a stochastic storm transposition model. We'll be developing specific cases to investigate how do changes in seasonality and changes in extreme events combine to affect the characteristics of floods. So we're focusing on how those antecedent conditions, especially soil moisture and seasonal evolution of that can affect flood risk. I'm happy to take questions if anyone has any.
All right, thank you. I think our last slide here, Diana was not able to join us, so I'm going to invite Olivia Ledee to say a couple words about this project. Olivia, if you're able.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. So as we've sort of heard a little bit, brook trout can be easily stressed by warming stream temperatures, either stress or reaching lethal temperatures. And that's not consistent across watersheds. We know that watersheds that have groundwater sources are a little bit more resilient to climate change than those without. But identifying those upwellings or those groundwater sources are very challenging to identify this refugia. And so Diana Carwin and colleagues who are based at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus are using a novel technology, which we're hoping can be applied in many other locations. So remote sensing, but using drones and thermal infrared imaging cameras to see if they can detect the cold water inputs across stream systems. They'll be in the White River watershed. And this is one about trying to identify a novel approach that is relatively inexpensive and accessible to identify thermal refugia for stream systems. So this is a novel methodology that's needed for other systems in the region, as well as identifying potential thermal refugia for brook trout, again, in the White River watershed. So more questions, feel free to reach out to them.
All right. Thanks so much, Olivia. And thank you to everyone for presenting today and joining us on this call. That is it for projects. I'm going to hand things over to Jessica Hellmann. Jessica, do you want me to continue running slides? You can just
Sure.
All right.
Sure. Thanks, Jess. Well, hi, everybody. I'm happy to be here with all of you. Please forgive me. I have a Kleenex here and a glass of water. I have a head cold and I'm going to do my best to keep my voice and make our way through these slides. Okay, so we're doing something a little bit different here. The first half of our gathering here was really focused on activities in the CASC. I want to step us out of the CASC for the second half of this meeting and talk about the recent UN climate meetings that were happening in Egypt and invite us all to think about what is our relationship here in a regional, nation-based adaptation center. How do we interact with an international climate change process? What lessons might we take from it? And how might we contribute to a global endeavor? At the same time, sharing with you all a little bit about the climate gatherings if you haven't attended previously. So it's a picking our head up and looking at a very broad scope of what it means to be engaged in climate change work. And I can share this with you because I attended the first of 2 weeks of the UN climate meetings as part of managing the suite of badges that we are able to deploy at the University of Minnesota. And I know many of you are also at organizations and institutions that also have the ability to attend the UN meetings, or you could if you were to apply to the UN to do so. And I would be very happy to share with anyone how our process works, if that would be helpful to you to enable your engagement in the future through your institutions or organizations. Okay, next slide, Jess. So when we say UN climate meetings, and forgive me for those of you who are very familiar with this, but I suspect a lot of us are a little bit familiar. So I'm going to summarize to make sure we're all on the same page. When we say the UN climate meetings, we're really talking about the UNFCCC Conference of the Parties. So the UNFCCC is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that was established at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro back in the 90s, 1992. We established both the Framework Convention on Climate Change and also the Framework on Biodiversity, which has a meeting coming up very shortly in Montreal. All of the signatories to the Framework Convention are what we call parties. And on an annual basis, all of the parties get together to continue the work of the Framework Convention. So the, for example, is a signatory to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that obligates us by international treaty to the terms of that framework convention and obligates our participation in the Conference of the Parties. Now, the US, for example, has or has not adopted or engaged in particular aspects of what has been happening through the UN Framework Convention. So, for example, the Kyoto Protocol comes out of the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the US did not participate in the Kyoto Protocol, but we're a party to the convention regardless. And we count them. Conference of the Parties, number 1, number 2, number 3. I think the Kyoto Protocol, Kyoto was maybe COP7. The most recent meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, shown on this map, was COP27. So depending on how old you are, you might think this has been going on for forever, like your entire life. Or you might remember when these things when they started. I sometimes think it's interesting to remember that we are at COP27. We've been participating in this international process of deliberation on climate change for 27 consecutive years. So this is where we're gathered on the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt on the Red Sea. Next slide. So I had the privilege of being part, we have the University of Minnesota, like many other institutions, can take, we had 7 badges that we can turn into 14 participants. We divide them into 1 of 2 weeks. So this is myself, this is Jessica Connect, for some of you might know Jess. We were part of week 1. Here's the rest of our week 1 delegation. Not shown is a separate group of Minnesota folks who attended during week 2. When you go to these meetings, next slide, Jess, what are these about? I think of them as really 3 different suites of activities. One is as an observer. The reason why we get to go is we are official observers to the climate conference deliberations. We are not parties. We are not parties. We do not negotiate. Those of us coming from, say, institutions of higher education are there to represent, to pay attention, to tell the story, to engage in those negotiations as observers. There are people there who are official parties and they are negotiators on behalf of their countries. So this is a photo, for example, of one of the global negotiations that was going on at the meeting. Alongside of those global negotiations is basically a massive conference. This is a picture on the right of the US pavilion. Each of the countries, the parties, and many other organizations sponsor little booths or pavilions where they run talks and have displays, and there are hundreds of presentations and panel discussions going on at the same time, maybe thousands, across the conference venue. So you can go to the UN climate meetings and engage in deliberations, say as an academic or on topics of interest to you, without ever participating in the global negotiations. All of this content that's depicted on this slide happens in what we call the blue zone. So you have to be an official UN designated organization and participant to get a badge to participate. You may also have heard of other people who attended the conference at other activities that maybe are happening at hotels or that are outside of the blue zone alongside of the conference. And the next slide shows the other big thing that we go to do, and that is to go talk to people. Outside of the official conferences or presentations or symposia that you might be part of or listen to, and outside of the global negotiations, people are just meeting and talking. This is a picture of one of our students at the University of Minnesota. He arranged for us to have a meeting with an economic minister, a professor that he had previously, who is now serving in the Egyptian government. So this is an example of a networking opportunity that we participated in. So you network, you go to conference, and you observe the negotiations. Next slide. So let's come back to those global negotiations. What actually happened in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt? After 2 weeks of discussion, this conference is going on, which has the function of basically it's like the chatter that happens around the negotiations. And the has a lot of influence on the nature of the conversation that goes on in the global negotiations, as does some of the chatter even in the media or among other leaders or people who are trying to interject ideas and concepts into the discussions. But this is literally a case of the world having a discourse alongside of the formal negotiations. So I'd like to share with you what are the major takeaways from Sharm el-Sheikh, and then I want to come back around and ask what it might mean for us in our Midwest CASC. So next slide. These are my extractions from what's called the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan. So the implementation plan, you can find this document online. This is what came out of COP27. I have just extracted pieces that I think are particularly salient for our purposes here. So the one main takeaway of the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan, and by the way, whenever something comes out of the meetings, it's always named and associated with where the meeting took place, like the Kyoto Protocol or the Paris Agreement or the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan. So a number of things in the implementation plans are affirmational. They reassert things that the parties still agree to be true. And they tend to have words like noting and also recognizing and underlying. So the bold here is my emphasis. The text comes directly from the agreement. So one of the things the agreement says is it's still reminding us that it's very important to ensure the integrity of all ecosystems, including forests, the ocean, and the cryosphere, as well as biodiversity, recognized by some cultures as Mother Earth, and also sort of increasingly and newly in the last couple of COPs, noting the importance of climate justice. This has been a rising theme in the last few years. It also separately from ecosystems calls out water as a particularly critical service needing to be conferred adaptation benefits, co-benefits, and environmental safeguards. An important theme at this meeting, especially with the Montreal biodiversity meetings coming up, was a recognition that the climate change crisis and the biodiversity crisis are not independent, but they need to be formally linked. And this ends up being represented as a concept in the implementation plan, underlines the urgent need to address in a comprehensive and synergistic manner the interlinked global crises of climate and biodiversity loss, aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals and protecting and conserving and restoring nature and ecosystems. So we, as Midwest CASC, we sit right at the heart of those interlinked global crises. Next slide. More affirmation text. Another critical thing that was discussed at Sharm el-Sheikh is, are we on track to achieve the Paris Agreement? The Paris Agreement, set in 2015, established 2 degrees C or hopefully 1.5 degrees C as the agreed upon targets for climate change mitigation. And so the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan says, no, we're still working toward that. We reiterate that we're working toward 1.5, even more so than 2. A big discussion at the meeting was whether or not this is in any way still feasible, but it was language adopted again this time. Another major emphasis of the meetings, which is why this is also referred to as an implementation plan, is that now is a moment in time where we are supposed to be accelerating climate action. And Sharm el-Sheikh was supposed to be focus on implementation. So there's text that says, we appreciate, it's always the host government who sort of sets the tone. So the host government tried to place implementation at the center of this meeting through something they called an implementation summit, which is basically just a focus of conversation, and for their support in enhancing and accelerating the implementation of climate action. If we have any hope whatsoever of achieving that 1.5, the only way we will get there is to accelerate the implementation of climate action, because the commitments that are in place now are not sufficient. Next slide. Now, there's a whole bunch of stuff in the text also about adaptation. So let's share some sample points from that. Importantly, not only are we failing to achieve 1.5 degrees with our committed actions, we're also falling behind on previous commitments for adaptation action, and especially adaptation financing. So the implementation plan says there are notes with serious concern the existing gap between current levels of adaptation and levels needed to respond to what basically the IPCC tells us are the consequences we'll be facing and are already facing this climate change. Who lives in that gap? We do. The plan also urges parties to adopt transformational approaches to enhancing adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability. My understanding is this is an attempt not only to say, do we need more action and more funding, but we need to be smarter about the ways we go about doing that. We essentially need new ways, innovations in what it means to go after adaptive capacity and adaptation. The developed parties, meaning developed countries, are not paying enough money. There's a recognition that the commitments that were made to adaptation financing are not being fulfilled. So there's a point about not only scaling their provisions of climate finance, but also technology transfer and capacity building transfer, so that developing countries have the ability to confront adaptation and to build adaptation plans for their own needs. And then there's a particular call out for the importance of basically ecosystems, especially water-related ecosystems, as a critical part of adaptation actions around the world. Next slide. You probably heard in the media, because the main thing that was talked about during the climate meetings is what's called loss and damage. And this was really, in some respects, the only innovative thing that came out of Sharm el-Sheikh. There was not a reiteration of something that had been said before or a new point of emphasis. And that is the consideration for the first time of matters relating to funding arrangements, yet to be specified what those funding arrangements look like, responding to loss and damage associated with adverse effects of climate change. So this is not mitigation. This is not adaptation. This is straight up money to respond to losses and damage. So think about this as disaster relief. It's also related to a reconciliation or compensation for damages that are likely to occur. So this is future work to be done to actually specify what this loss and damage support would look like. But it's a new addition to the way we think about reducing greenhouse gas emissions and adapting to a changing climate. I'll put in here for our purposes that in addition to funding arrangements for loss and damage, the Sharm el-Sheikh implementation plan talks about catalyzing technical assistance about responding to adverse effects of climate change. So again, not just adapting to it, but actually disaster response. Next slide. And then a few other things that I think are very particularly important for us in the CASC. So the implementation plan invites parties to consider as appropriate nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based solutions for both mitigation and adaptation while ensuring relevant social and environmental safeguards. So this was a dominant, nature-based solutions are a dominant theme in the conference and the conversation going on around the implementation plan or going around the global negotiations in Sharm el-Sheikh. There isn't specific language about new financing or new goals associated with that, but a continued recognition that we seek nature-based solutions in both mitigation and adaptation. And For the last several years, really, this was also a major theme in Paris in 2015, is an increasing recognition that civil society, particularly Indigenous people, local communities, and young people must be included in climate action. And the implementation reiterates this. At the Sharm el-Sheikh meetings, there was a large emphasis placed on youth and children engagement in the sort of intergenerational equity consideration. Okay, next slide. One more thing that was going on, there were several other things that are also in conversation at the global negotiations, not just leading to the implementation plan, but is sort of ongoing business that the Framework Convention on Climate Change has been working on. There have been working on some continuing work on targets, on financing, methods of financing. You can sort of think of those as implementation details about previous decisions that were made. A new interesting thing that was put on the table last year and was supposed to be worked on and was worked on between Glasgow and Sharm el-Sheikh was an adaptation to-do list. I went to a couple of sessions that were negotiating and continuing to work on what was called the adaptation agenda. It didn't make a lot of progress at the meetings. Most people expressed a desire to spend more time, or most parties expressed a desire to spend more time with this idea and wanting to continue work on an adaptation agenda. The basic idea behind the adaptation agenda is to create a list of sort of targets. We have 1.5 or 2 degrees C as the target for mitigation. What are our targets or global aspirations for adaptation that we can use to determine whether or not we're making progress against those goals? So the idea was to come up with a suite of adaptation outcomes that the UN Framework Convention could work toward, say, by 2030. And further, these adaptation actions were intended to cross several sectors: food and ag, water and nature, coasts and oceans, human settlements, and infrastructure. My understanding is this list, again, didn't get finalized or adopted, but it's an ongoing conversation, and we would expect meetings in the intervening period before the next COP and for the discussion of the next COP. Definitely relevant to us. Next slide. So I would love thoughts in the chat, or if folks would like to chime in. But here's what I think my little synopsis might offer us in the Midwest CASC, or those of us who are kind of working at the local and national and regional scale on adaptation, how we might connect to or advance some of these international objectives. So here are my thoughts. Please chime in with your additional ones. Firstly, the United States as our country, our party, cannot meet its national commitments either on mitigation or on adaptation without actual regional implementation. So the US cannot show up in the international negotiations saying it's doing the things that it said it was going to do if the constituent components of that country aren't actually pursuing those things. So one critical thing we do is we make it possible for the US to actually meet its commitments, both in mitigation and adaptation. I think the Midwest CASC is also critical for establishing examples and for innovation around nature-based solutions. Everyone wants nature-based solutions. What are best practices? We're discovering those in our region and in collaborations with other CASCs, exploring them more generally. Those nature-based solutions would meet the dual goal of enhancing resilience / adaptation, and ideally also mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. So I put that. I think we are not only pursuing adaptation, but when we're doing that well, we're also pursuing solutions that help reduce greenhouse gas emission reductions. That is a key commitment of the UN process, is that dual achievement, those co-benefits. I think that we have a responsibility in our region to really lean into the commitments that are in the international agreement around Indigenous peoples, local communities, cities, and civil society as a collection of universities and higher education, tribal colleges. We also have a duty to young people. I think we could be thinking more about the degree to which our solutions are replicable outside of our region and outside of our country. And one of those things we might think a lot about, it's clear that a lot of the international debate is around financing and finding ways of pursuing creative financing. So when we're thinking not only about technical solutions, we might also be thinking, I wonder, if we be thinking about how they get paid for and how we finance and pursue financial transfers between beneficiaries and maybe responsible parties. And then an interesting question, I think, for us is to what degree can we contribute to this technical assistance component? Where we are in a developed country, we have quite a lot of resources that are deployed in our Midwest CASC that actually provides technical assistance within our country. Do we have responsibilities, or how might we participate in technical assistance to other parties or other countries? So there may be other thoughts. I see Gabe Filippelli has a comment. Yes, connection between enhancing resilience and greenhouse gases, and how do we do that in ways that engage and young people as well. I welcome any other thoughts. Those are my observations. I think, Jess, that's my last slide for my little synopsis of what it was like to be at this place where there are global negotiations going on and a big conference and lots of interpersonal interactions, a summary of what happened in those international negotiations, and my own lens of how I see that international process interfacing with the things that we're pursuing here at the Midwest CASC. So I open the floor to any comments or thoughts or further questions, or if others were in attendance as well and they'd like to share their experiences. Another thing we might think about is going into the next meeting, if as the Midwest CASC, we actually want to strategize who in our network is going, and we might be able to be a little bit more strategic about how we show up as a region in the meetings if we have some representation, which I did not do that so much this time. Floor is open.
Hey, Jessica, it's Ralph.
Hi, Ralph.
Hey there. I think one thing that the Midwest CASC might do that would be beneficial towards meeting some of these things that you've listed is that within the Midwest, at least around the Great Lakes, we do have a relatively huge restoration fund, GLRI, right? And I don't think that GLRI is, maximizing or optimizing its potential for turning restorations into, for example, mitigating greenhouse gases, sequestering carbon, enhancing resilience, coming up with nature-based solutions, and I think part of the reason for that is, we don't have really a good comprehensive background for GLRI to understand what the potential is. Like, for example, if you tweak restoration practices in a certain way, how might that improve carbon sequestration, right? And the clock is ticking, right? It's like, to maximize that type of, that type of climate mitigation, let's just say, the sooner GLRI is cognizant of incorporating that into their project selection criteria, the greater the cumulative effects are going to be. So I think that there could be a good, there were talks before about how some of the, I forgot what you call them, the projects, what I forgot what term you guys use, but
Priorities, yes.
Yeah, whatever. But so anyhow, I'll sort of stop there. But I think that there's a big potential for, some melding of what the Midwest CASC can provide and what GLRI can achieve.
So Ralph, how would one do that? How does, right, so the objectives of GLRI are pretty well specified, aren't they? How do we go about
There's
aligning those more aggressively with concepts of resilience or sequestration?
so the GLRI produces an action plan every 5 years for the subsequent 5 years, and they solicit feedback and comments, and they're doing it right now. I mean, I know that, we just submitted comments from the USGS last week on focus area 4, which is species and habitat, and actually had a fair emphasis on climate change mitigation and adaptation in our comments as not being systematically applied. And so anyhow, that's so you, just like you were party to COP there, I think that the Midwest CASC can be a party to the GLRI action planning process.
Interesting. Great. Kim, do you want to say what you typed in here also, or voice that?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm not going to put on my camera. The idea I had was just to think about how we can help facilitate coordination of implementation, just thinking about the fact that a lot of our challenges sort of operate at regional or larger scales, but individual projects are typically at a local scale, but would probably be a lot more effective if we concentrated them or targeted them, or at least thought about how to arrange projects in a network so that they have the benefit that we would hope they would have at a larger scale. So thinking about things like landscape connectivity or freshwater connectivity or reducing the impacts of flooding, how do we kind of connect those projects so that they actually are more effective, because there's lots of projects kind of connected together.
And then Carrie, do you want to say something about this PDF that you just, the adaptation, Region 5 adaptation implementation plan?
Sure, Carrie McElhenney, USC Region 5. I'm actually in the water division, so I'm not part of Glenpoe in our EPA organizational structure. But I want to point out, the EPA, much like a lot of the other federal agencies, released adaptation plans. Our regional adaptation plan includes our Great Lakes Protection, Great Lakes Program Office, and they have some proposed adaptation activities, which get to what I think the previous speaker was alluding to in terms of ways to sort of incorporate climate adaptation, mitigation, resiliency into GLRI. And so I'd encourage you to take a peek at the actions that are laid out there in our plan. This was released about a month ago. And we could probably get someone from Glenpoe to maybe attend a future meeting like this to sort of flesh out further what they have in mind and ways to incorporate other ideas from outside of EPA at least.
Laura, would you like to raise your comment?
Sure. Hi, my name is Laura Masacchio. I'm at the University of Minnesota in the Department of Landscape Architecture. I'm an associate professor there, and it's exciting to see what's come out of all the recent climate conference. And I think the challenge here is how to bridge going from the science, policy, and governance into implementation. And it suggests sorry, that's my microwave. Hold on. Sorry about that. I'm eating lunch. The critical thing is really, hold on. Sorry.
Zoom is a great thing.
Sorry. It was the timer for something I was cooking. Sorry. We all have those moments. Yeah, I have to, after this, I have to go teach my class and commute to campus. The question is, what kind of bridging will you be needing? That kind of organizational structural piece. There's the Midwest CASC kind of part, but as soon as you kind of go into other places like cities, towns, what kind of structure and organization that's needed. For example, different ecoregions, sometimes people use bioregions, landscapes and places, and those have all different, and also the social side of that, different tribes, different communities, different stakeholders. It's a big endeavor, huge endeavor to step down in those scales to figure that out. And maybe it's good to think about what particular scale would really help. And I'll tell you some in my background. I look at green space design and planning. I'd say thinking about metropolitan scales or regional scales or watersheds, there's some kind of key scales to start thinking that link up to that maybe national scale, global, or kind of to that local scale. And so I think deciding where maybe like adaptation and resilience, it could include some sustainability, how would that play out? And so maybe I'm suggesting a framework, because linking that kind of conceptual piece where people talk at conferences down to how do we do it, that how question is really key, I think, and who and what and where, why. I think going from this more general discussions to specificity, it's probably the biggest challenge of trying to step those scales. So that's it. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. The scaling issue, it's very overwhelming. The scale at those UN meetings is pretty mind-boggling. And Ellen Ketterson, I would love to give you the last 1 minute. What do you mean, look back at our multi-pronged circle of goals and consolidate water, wildlife, cities, and towns? As we look at our stay in touch slide that reminds everyone where they can follow us and learn more about the Midwest CASC. Are you there, Ellen? No. Maybe not. Did she sign off?
I think she did. I'm seeing that her name.
Okay, well, I think that's right. As we think about within the Midwest CASC, our objectives, how do we formally link them back to our responsibilities, our natural and cultural resources? How do they connect to other objectives? So we've reached the top of the hour. I hope you found that a little bit interesting. I know probably folks were reading about it in their local paper, the New York Times. That was the sort of on the ground synopsis. Thinking about how we do our best work here and how we be connected around the world is, I think, important. And I really appreciate this learning more about how to connect with GLRI too. So thanks for that, Ralph. Okay, everybody, thanks for your time. We'll see you next month.